Take that damn thing off right now, Sergeant, or I'll have the bailiff drag you straight into a county holding cell. Judge Gerald Sterling's heavy wooden gavel smashed down against the bench, sending a sharp crack through the packed courtroom. He wasn't looking at the law. He wasn't looking at the real estate deeds sitting on his desk. He was staring with pure, unadulterated venom at the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to the chest of my Army service uniform. The very piece of metal that 3 of my best friends died in the dust of the Korengal Valley for me to wear. Across the aisle, my brother's wife, Chloe, didn't even bother to cover her smug grin. She adjusted her designer jacket, leaned back in her leather chair, and crossed her legs with the quiet confidence of a woman who thought she had already won. For 14 agonizing months, she'd dragged me through mud, filed false financial claims, and tried to starve me out with legal fees just to force a partition sale on my late father's $750,000 Timberland ranch. She thought today was the grand finale. She thought an aggressive, loudmouth judge in a small-town courtroom was going to break me in 5 minutes. What Chloe didn't know, and what Judge Sterling was about to find out the hard way, was that the black leather binder sitting right next to my left hand held a document that was going to destroy every single career sitting on that judicial bench before the sun went down. "I asked you a question, Master Sergeant Vance." Sterling slammed his palm down, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of plum. "This is a court of law, not a parade ground for you to parade your war souvenirs and manipulate my courtroom." My name is Ethan Vance. I spent 14 years in the United States Army, most of it inside the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've survived roadside IEDs, close-quarters firefights in pitch-black valleys, and interrogations that would make a weak man lose his mind. I don't flinch because a man in a black robe raises his voice. I looked Judge Sterling dead in his eyes, kept my voice as cold and flat as a steel blade, and spoke so clearly that even the court reporter's fingers froze over her stenograph machine. "With all due respect, Your Honor," I said, "this uniform is worn in accordance with Army Regulation 600-8-22. And this medal wasn't handed out in a cereal box. It stays where it is." "Are you refusing a direct instruction from this court?" Sterling bellowed, rising 2 inches out of his chair. "I'm informing you of federal law, Your Honor," I replied, not moving a single inch. "And if you touch that gavel again to cite me for contempt, I suggest you read the document my attorney is about to hand you first." The gallery gasped. Chloe's smile instantly evaporated, her polished fingernails digging hard into her leather purse. Beside her, my younger brother Julian looked like he wanted to crawl under the oak table and vanish into the floorboards. My attorney, Nathan Miller, a sharp, quiet former JAG officer who didn't scare easily, stood up slowly. He held a thick navy blue folder in his hands. He didn't look nervous. In fact, he looked like a man who had just laid down a royal flush against a guy bluffing with a pair of 2s. "Permission to approach the bench, Your Honor," Nathan said, his tone smooth and razor-sharp. "Before you make a ruling that you cannot undo, there are 3 specific federal filings you need to examine." Sterling glared at Nathan, his breathing heavy, his chest heaving under his robe. "This is a simple property dispute over an 800-acre timber parcel. I will not have this courtroom turned into a circus." "It isn't a circus, Judge," Nathan replied, stepping right up to the bench and dropping the blue folder onto the polished mahogany with a dull, heavy thud. "It's a federal disclosure notice, and I suggest you take a very close look at page 3 before you call the sheriff." The air in the courtroom got thick. You could hear the high-pitched hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. You could hear the faint, frantic scratching of Chloe's lawyer whispering into her ear, his face turning pale as he realized something was horribly off-script. Judge Sterling yanked the blue folder toward himself, flipping the cover open with a harsh snap. I turned my head slightly and looked back at the gallery. In the 3rd row, sitting entirely in the shadows, were 2 men in dark, tailored suits. They weren't locals. They weren't court regulars who came to watch small-town drama. One of them was Colonel Douglas Hayes, my former commanding officer, a man who had spent 32 years in uniform and now sat on the Regional Veterans Judicial Advisory Board. Beside him sat a regional investigator from the State Judicial Conduct Commission. Neither of them said a word. They just sat there with their hands folded in their laps, watching Judge Sterling's eyes dart across the first page. I watched the color drain out of Sterling's face. It didn't happen all at once. First, The deep red flush on his neck faded into a sallow, sickly yellow. Then his jaw went completely slack. His hand, which had been resting proudly on his gavel, slid back an inch, as if the wood had suddenly turned burning hot to the touch. Where did you get this?" Sterling stammered, his booming voice suddenly sounding thin and raspy. "That document was certified by the Office of the Special Counsel at 6 o'clock this morning, Your Honor," Nathan said, leaning in just enough so only the judge and the court reporter could hear every single syllable. "Which means every word you've spoken since you walked through those double doors has been recorded, time-stamped, and transmitted directly to state-federal liaisons." Chloe stood up from her chair, her voice shrill and desperate. "Your Honor, what is going on? This is a stalling tactic. He's just trying to confuse the court so he doesn't have to sign the partition order." "Sit down, Mrs. Vance," Sterling snapped, his voice cracking like a dry twig. "Excuse me?" Chloe gasped, completely stunned. "I said sit down." Sterling slammed his hand down, but this time his voice lacked any real power. He was trembling. I could see the light catching the faint shake in his right index finger as he turned to the second page of the dossier. To understand how a respected county judge ended up shaking in his own courtroom, you have to understand the 14 months of pure hell that brought me to that exact carpet. It started the week after my father passed away. Dad had been a logger and a craftsman his entire life. He bought those 800 acres of prime timberland in Oregon back in 1984, building a heavy timber sawmill with his own two hands. He worked that land until his lungs gave out, and when he died, his will was crystal clear. The property was left 50-50 to my younger brother Julian and me. I didn't want to sell a single square foot. I wanted to turn the old sawmill into a woodworking shop for returning combat veterans, a place where guys coming back with PTSD could learn a trade, cut timber, and get their heads straight in the quiet of the forest. I had already secured a nonprofit grant to cover the operational costs. I didn't need a single dime from Julian. But Julian hadn't been in charge of his own life since the day he married Chloe. Chloe was a real estate agent who lived 3 steps above her means. She drove a luxury SUV she couldn't afford, wore designer clothes bought on credit cards, and talked about people behind their backs like they were disposable garbage. The second my father's heart stopped, Chloe saw 800 acres of pristine timberland as her personal winning lottery ticket. She wanted to sell the entire ranch to a commercial resort development group for $850,000. When I told her no, gently at first, explaining what Dad's dream had been, she didn't listen. She didn't care about Dad's dream. She didn't care about veterans. She cared about a $200,000 commission cut and a down payment on a gated community house in the suburbs. 2 weeks later, the harassment began. First came the code enforcement complaints. Suddenly, county inspectors were showing up at the sawmill every Tuesday, citing me for imaginary environmental violations, claiming old equipment was leaking oil into the creek. Every single complaint was signed anonymously, but I recognized the vocabulary in the reports. It was pure Chloe. Then came the bank freezes. Chloe filed an emergency injunction claiming I was mismanaging shared estate assets, freezing the joint maintenance account my father had set up to pay the property taxes. I had to use my personal military savings, over $40,000, just to keep the county from placing a tax lien on the acreage. Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. Every time I called him, Chloe answered his phone. Every time I drove out to his house, the blinds were drawn and the garage door stayed down. She had completely isolated him, convincing him that I was the greedy older brother hoarding an inheritance that belonged to his future children. When none of that worked to break me, Chloe went for the nuclear option. She hired Vance Bradley, a high-priced corporate litigation lawyer known in the county for dirty tactics, and filed a formal partition lawsuit to force a court-ordered sheriff's auction of the entire property. And that brought us right to Judge Gerald Sterling. From the very first pretrial hearing, Sterling's bias wasn't just obvious, it was sickening. He cut off my attorney mid-sentence, ignored our motions for mediation, and openly favored Chloe's legal team. He treated me like a rogue squatter trying to steal from my brother. I couldn't figure out why a veteran circuit judge was pushing so aggressively for a rushed sale. It didn't make logical sense. Court proceedings for land disputes usually took months, sometimes years. Sterling was rushing this through in less than 90 days, cutting every legal corner he could find. So 3 weeks ago, I did what any good ranger does when he realizes he's walking into an ambush. I scouted the terrain. I called Nathan, my lawyer, and we started digging into the public land records, tax disclosures, and corporate registries. What we found made my blood run cold. The resort development company trying to buy my father's timberland wasn't just a random out-of-state corporation. It was a subsidiary of a real estate holding group called Cascade Crest Holdings. And one of the silent board members of Cascade Crest Holdings was a holding company registered under the maiden name of Judge Gerald Sterling's wife. If the property was forced into a quick court auction, Chloe's developer would buy it for pennies on the dollar. Judge Sterling's wife's holding company would pocket a massive consultation kickback, and Chloe would get her quick payout. The only thing standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar land grab was a retired master sergeant who refused to sign a piece of paper. They thought I was just a dumb grunt who knew how to shoot a rifle and follow orders. They thought because I kept my mouth shut and stayed quiet, I was an easy target. They had no idea. I didn't just collect evidence on the land deal. I reached out to my old commander, Colonel Douglas Hayes, who worked directly with federal oversight agencies handling judicial integrity and military protection acts. Together, we compiled a 70-page dossier detailing the financial conflict of interest, the illegal rush of judicial proceedings, and the blatant violation of federal statutes regarding the treatment of military personnel in civil courts. We filed it with the State Judicial Conduct Commission at 6 o'clock that very morning, and we kept the envelope sealed until Judge Sterling showed his true colors on the bench. Back in the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. Judge Sterling was staring down at page 3 of the folder. His hands were visibly shaking now. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet room as he turned to the signature page. This is an active federal inquiry, Sterling whispered, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. That is correct, Your Honor, Nathan said, taking a step closer to the bench. Which means, under State Judicial Canon 4, you are legally obligated to recuse yourself from these proceedings immediately. Furthermore, any order signed by this bench regarding the Vance estate over the last 90 days is rendered null and void pending the outcome of the ethics investigation. You can't do this, Chloe screamed, leaping out of her chair, her face contorted in pure rage. She slammed her hands down on her table, ignoring her lawyer, who was frantically pulling at her sleeve trying to shut her up. He's lying. Ethan is making this up. He's using his military background to bully the court. Judge, sign the sale order. You promised us this would be finished today. The entire courtroom went dead quiet. You promised us this would be finished today. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Chloe had just admitted, in front of 50 witnesses, a court reporter, and 2 state investigators, that there had been a prior arrangement between her legal team and the presiding judge. Judge Sterling looked at Chloe with a look of pure terror. If looks could kill, she would have dropped dead right there on the carpet. Mrs. Vance, Sterling stammered, his voice dropping an octave, shut your mouth immediately, or I will have you removed by force. Don't you tell me to shut my mouth, Chloe shrieked, completely unraveling as she realized her massive payday was slipping through her fingers. We paid over $15,000 in retainer fees to Bradley's firm because he said you were in our corner. Julian, tell them how much money we spent. Julian buried his face in his hands, slumping down in his seat like a broken man. He didn't say a word. He looked completely defeated, crushed under the weight of his wife's insane greed and the horrifying reality of what she had dragged him into. Nathan turned smoothly toward the gallery and motioned with his hand. Your Honor, for the record, I would like to introduce our final witness to verify the authenticity of the federal filings. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, echoing thud. Colonel Douglas Hayes stood up from the third row. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate stride of a soldier who owned every room he ever walked into. He was wearing his full service dress uniform, his chest covered in ribbons, his silver hair neatly trimmed. Beside him, the regional investigator stood up, pulling a leather badge wallet from his jacket and holding it up for the court bailiff to see. Your Honor, Colonel Hayes said, his voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings. I am Colonel Douglas Hayes, United States Army, retired. I am here representing the Regional Veterans Legal Defense Council and the Federal Judicial Integrity Task Force. Judge Sterling looked like he was about to have a massive heart attack. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning chalk white. Colonel, Sterling choked out, this is a civil matter, a family dispute. It ceased to be a civil matter the moment you attempted to order a decorated master sergeant to strip his military honors off his chest to humiliate him in open court, Colonel Hayes said, his voice dropping into a low, thunderous growl. "And it ceased to be a simple family dispute when your wife's holding company accepted a $40,000 options payment from the developer seeking to purchase the Vance Timberland." A loud collective gasp went through the gallery. Chloe's lawyer, Vance Bradley, slowly closed his briefcase, packed up his papers, and quietly stepped 3 feet away from Chloe, completely abandoning her at the defense table. He knew his career was on the line now, and he wanted zero part of the legal grenade that had just detonated in the middle of the room. "Your Honor," Nathan said, bringing everyone's focus right back to the front. "We are requesting an immediate stay of all proceedings, a formal order of recusal, and a referral of this file to the State Attorney General's Office for civil fraud and judicial misconduct." Sterling sat frozen for 5 agonizing seconds. You could see the internal collapse happening right behind his eyes. 40 years of legal standing, authority, and power dissolved in a matter of minutes because he thought he could trample over a quiet veteran who didn't fight back with loud words, but with cold, calculated strategy. Sterling didn't even use his gavel. He reached out with a trembling hand, pushed the case file away from him, and looked at the clerk. "This court is adjourned indefinitely," Sterling said, his voice barely audible. "Case is transferred to the state presiding judge for immediate reassignment." He stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall behind him. Without looking at Chloe, without looking at the gallery, and without saying another word, Judge Gerald Sterling turned and practically ran through the side door into his private chambers. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters who had been sitting in the back row rushed out the doors to make phone calls. Spectators were murmuring and pointing. Chloe stood at her table, her eyes wild, looking around the room like a trapped animal. She grabbed her designer purse and swung around to face me, her face flushed red with hatred. "You ruined everything!" she screamed at me, her voice echoing off the walls. "You self-righteous bastard!" "You think you're so brave with your stupid medals? We are going to take every single tree off that land. I will sue you until you don't have a single dollar left." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I stepped right up to her table, leaned down slightly, and looked her straight in the eyes. "The lawsuit is over, Chloe," I said, my voice calm, low, and completely unshakable. "And if you ever step foot on my father's ranch again, I won't call a civil lawyer. I'll call the county sheriff to arrest you for criminal trespass. Now take your purse and get out of my sight." She stared at me, her lips trembling, realization finally sinking in that she had zero power left. She looked at her lawyer, but Bradley wouldn't even look at her. He was already walking out the back doors with his head down. Chloe grabbed her coat, spat on the floor near my boots, and stormed out of the courtroom, her high heels clacking furiously against the tile floor until the double doors slammed shut behind her. Julian remained sitting at the table alone. I walked over to my younger brother. He didn't look up at me. He just sat there, staring at his hands, tears silently dropping onto the polished oak wood. "Julian," I said softly. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he choked out, his voice cracking with emotion. "God, I'm so sorry. She told me we were broke. She told me you were going to sell it without me and leave us with nothing. I was so stupid. I was so damn stupid." I placed my heavy hand on his shoulder, giving it a firm, solid squeeze. "She played you, brother," I said quietly. "She played you against the only family you had left. But it's over now. The land is safe." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. "Are you going to hate me forever?" "You're my brother," I replied. "Dad didn't raise us to hate each other over money. But you need to fix your life, Julian. You need to decide if you want to be a man or if you want to be a puppet for a woman who almost put you in state prison." Julian nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He stood up, gave me a brief, desperate hug, and walked out of the courtroom alone, a long road of recovery sitting right in front of him. 2 months later, the dust finally settled. The State Judicial Conduct Commission completed its investigation. Judge Gerald Sterling was officially stripped of his judicial robe, permanently disbarred, and ordered to pay massive restitution fees. A secondary criminal investigation by the State Attorney General was launched into Cascade Crest Holdings, leading to several indictments for bribery and land fraud across 3 counties. Chloe filed for divorce 3 weeks after the trial, realizing Julian had no money and no control over the Timberland estate. In the divorce settlement, the judge, a new, fair-minded magistrate reassigned to the county, ruled that Chloe was personally liable for $75,000 of my legal fees due to filing a bad-faith, fraudulent lawsuit. She had to sell her luxury SUV and move back in with her mother just to pay off her debts. Julian moved into a small cabin near the edge of the property. He started coming over to the sawmill every morning at 7 o'clock. We didn't talk about the lawsuit much. We just worked. We cleared brush, cut pine, and rebuilt the old timber frames that our father had put up 30 years ago. Slowly, brick by brick, the trust between us began to heal. 6 months after that Tuesday in court, we held the official grand opening of the Vance Veteran Woodworking Center.
Over 40 people showed up, local neighbors, veterans from around the state, Colonel Hayes, and Nathan Miller. We cut the ribbon right in front of the main workshop, under the huge hand-carved sign bearing our father's name. As the sun began to set behind the towering Oregon pines, casting a warm, golden light across the 800 acres of pristine timber, I stepped out onto the front porch of the main house. I reached up and touched the Distinguished Service Cross pinned to my jacket. People think medals are awarded for killing enemies or winning battles, but they aren't. They are given to remind you of the promise you made to protect the people standing next to you, no matter how terrifying the odds, no matter how hard the storm hits. A judge in a black robe thought he could use his power to take away my dignity and strip away my father's legacy for a dirty paycheck. He thought because he had a gavel, he held all the power. He forgot one simple truth. Honor isn't something given to you by a judge, and it isn't something that can be ordered away in a courtroom. It's built through sacrifice, carried with pride, and defended at all costs. If this story reminded you that standing up for what's right is always worth the fight, let me know in the comments below where you're reading from today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next story.